The red dust of Clearwater hung in the air like a veil of rust, carried on winds that swept down from the distant mountains and across the parched grasslands. It was the kind of dust that settled into everything: the creases of a man's face, the folds of a woman's dress, the very soul of the town itself. In the summer of 1887, that dust seemed heavier than usual, as if the earth itself was trying to bury the secrets that lay beneath. Main Street stretched like a scar through the heart of the settlement, flanked by weathered storefronts and saloons that leaned against each other for support. At one end stood the church, its whitewashed walls a defiant claim to civilization in this untamed land. At the other, the train depot promised escape to those brave enough to take it. But it was the building in the center of town that commanded the most respect, or perhaps fear. The Clearwater Bank and Trust stood like a monument to progress, its brick facade and brass fixtures gleaming with an authority that seemed almost obscene against the rough-hewn timber of its neighbors. From her bedroom window, on the second floor of the finest house in town, Evelyn Pratt watched the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap over the navy silk of her morning dress, imported from San Francisco at a cost that could feed a ranch hand for 3 months. At 32, she remained what the town gossips called a handsome woman, though the years had etched fine lines around her eyes, lines that spoke of too many mornings spent just like this one, watching and waiting for something she couldn't name. The floorboards creaked behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Edward. Her husband moved through their house like he moved through life, with purpose and possession, each step calculated to remind others of his importance. "You're up early," he said, though it wasn't a question. Edward Pratt didn't ask questions. He made observations that required no response. "The heat," Evelyn replied, her voice as carefully modulated as her posture. "It makes sleep difficult," Edward grunted, already fastening his gold watch chain across his vest. At 45, he had the satisfied look of a man who had gotten everything he'd ever wanted, including the beautiful young wife he'd acquired 15 years ago like another asset for his portfolio. "I'll be at the bank until late. The Cattlemen's Association is meeting about the new loans." He paused at the door, and she felt rather than saw his gaze on her back. "Wear the green dress tonight. Judge Morrison and his wife are coming for dinner." Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of his tobacco and pomade hanging in the air. Evelyn remained at the window, watching as he emerged below and strode down the front path, tipping his hat to Mrs. Wheaton from the Mercantile, who simpered and blushed like a girl. Everyone in Clearwater knew that Edward Pratt's charm was as calculated as his interest rates, but they smiled and scraped just the same. The morning stretched before her like an empty ledger, waiting to be filled with the careful arithmetic of a banker's wife's day. There would be calls to make, charity work to oversee, correspondence to answer, all the small, suffocating duties that kept the machinery of respectability running smooth. But first, she needed to check on the carriage. Yesterday, she'd noticed a wobble in the rear wheel, and while Edward wouldn't care unless it affected his own comfort, Evelyn couldn't bear the thought of poor Duchess, their mare, struggling with an unbalanced load. She descended the stairs, each step measured and graceful despite the rebellion in her heart. The house was a showpiece of Eastern refinement transported west. Turkish carpets, velvet drapes, a piano that no one played gathering dust in the parlor. It was a house meant to impress, not to live in, and Evelyn moved through it like a ghost haunting her own life. Outside, the heat was already building, promising another scorching day. She made her way to the carriage house, her boots clicking on the packed earth. Sure enough, the wheel was worse than she'd thought, the spokes loose and the iron rim beginning to separate from the wood. "Samuel?" she called for their stableman, but there was no answer. Likely he was already at the saloon, spending his wages before he'd properly earned them. Edward would rage about it later, but he'd never fire the man. Good help was hard to find in Clearwater, and Samuel knew too much about where Edward went on those nights when he claimed to be reviewing ledgers. Evelyn stood there, uncertain. The nearest wheelwright was clear on the other side of town, but there was a blacksmith much closer, just across the square. In fact, she could see the smoke rising from his forge even now, a black plume against the crystal morning sky. But Thomas Ward was not the sort of man a banker's wife should be calling upon. Not with his history. Not with those eyes that seemed to see too much. Still, what choice did she have? She couldn't very well drag the carriage across town, and she certainly couldn't leave Duchess to suffer. The blacksmith's shop sat on the edge of respectability. Close enough to Main Street to be necessary, but far enough away to be ignored. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil grew louder as Evelyn approached, and she found herself slowing, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her fine dress among the scattered horseshoes and wagon parts. The smithy itself was little more than a three-sided shed, open to the street, with a forge glowing like the mouth of hell in the back. And there, silhouetted against the flames, was Thomas Ward. She'd seen him before, of course, in a town the size of Clearwater. Everyone saw everyone, but she'd never really looked at him. Not like this. He worked shirtless in the heat, his broad back glistening with sweat, muscles moving beneath sun-darkened skin like something alive and separate. His arms rose and fell in a rhythm old as time itself, shaping the glowing iron with strikes that sent sparks cascading like fallen stars. Evelyn stood frozen, her carefully constructed propriety crumbling in the face of something raw and elemental. This was what her world worked so hard to hide, the fundamental truth of flesh and sweat and labor that made all their pretty pretenses possible. Thomas turned then, as if sensing her presence, and she found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment, neither spoke. He stood there, hammer still in hand, chest heaving from exertion, and she felt something shift inside her chest, a door creaking open that she'd thought rusted shut. "Mrs. Pratt." His voice was deep, roughened by smoke and dust. He reached for a shirt hanging on a nearby hook, pulling it on with movements that were somehow both casual and careful. "Something I can help you with? My carriage," she managed, hating how breathless she sounded. "The rear wheel is damaged. I was wondering if you might—" "I'll take a look." He set down his hammer, wiped his hands on a leather apron. "Where is it?" "At the house, but I could have it brought—" "No need. I'll come by this afternoon. If that suits." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He was standing closer now, and she could smell the smoke on him, the sharp scent of hot metal and honest work. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused. Nothing like Edward's soft, manicured fingers. They were hands that had known hardship, that had shaped and mended and perhaps broken things too. "This afternoon, then," she said, already backing away, already fleeing back to the safety of her silk-lined prison. But as she hurried across the square, she could feel his eyes on her back, and something inside her, something wild and long buried, stirred like a flame catching wind. Thomas Ward arrived at the Pratt house precisely at 3 o'clock, when the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Clearwater's dusty streets. Evelyn watched from the parlor window as he approached. Leading a mule loaded with tools, he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a man who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. "The blacksmith is here, ma'am," announced Martha, their housekeeper, with a slight pursing of her lips that conveyed her opinion of such visitors. "Thank you, Martha. Please offer him some water. It's terribly hot." Martha's lips pursed tighter, but she nodded and retreated. Evelyn waited a suitable interval before venturing out to the carriage house, telling herself she was merely checking on the progress of repairs. She found Thomas already at work, the damaged wheel removed and leaning against the wall. His concentration was absolute as he examined the broken spokes, running those scarred fingers along the wood with surprising gentleness. "It's worse than it looked," he said without turning around. "The whole wheel needs rebuilding. I can patch it temporary-like, but it won't hold for long." "Whatever you think best," Evelyn replied, trying to match his businesslike tone. He glanced at her then, and she saw something flicker in those storm-colored eyes. Amusement, perhaps, at her formal manner. Might take me coming back a few times. That be a problem? It should have been. She should have told him to take the wheel to his shop, to handle it all at a distance. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Of course not. Whatever is necessary." Over the following weeks, the wheel seemed to develop an unusual number of problems. Then it was a loose shoe on Duchess that needed attention. After that, the gate hinges that had chosen just that moment to rust through. Each repair required Thomas Ward's particular expertise, and each time he came, Evelyn found reasons to be present, checking on the progress, discussing the work, offering refreshments that he always politely declined. She learned things in fragments. That he'd come to Clearwater 5 years ago, that he'd learned his trade in the Kansas rail yards, that he read books. She'd seen a battered copy of Virgil tucked into his tool bag, though he'd quickly covered it when he noticed her looking. "My brother loved the classics," he'd said, his face closing off like a door swinging shut. Wanted to be a schoolteacher. Wanted, past tense. Evelyn didn't press, but she filed the information away with all the other pieces she was gathering, building a picture of this man who seemed so determined to remain a cipher. The town, meanwhile, was beginning to notice. Mrs. Wheaton mentioned, oh so casually, that the Pratt house seemed to require an awful lot of smithing work lately. Judge Morrison's wife wondered aloud at the Ladies' Aid Society whether it was entirely proper for Mrs. Pratt to be supervising such work personally. "One can't be too careful with the help these days," she'd said, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, especially with men of questionable background. Evelyn had smiled and changed the subject, but she'd felt the weight of their speculation, heavy as wet wool on her shoulders. Edward, for his part, seemed oblivious. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. His evenings were increasingly spent elsewhere, business meetings that required him to stay late at the bank, or political dinners that wives weren't expected to attend. Evelyn had stopped asking where he went. She'd stopped caring too, which frightened her more than his absence ever could. One evening in late September, when the heat had finally broken and the air carried the first hint of autumn, Evelyn stood on her bedroom balcony watching the town settle into darkness. Lamps were being lit along Main Street, creating pools of yellow light that made the shadows between seem deeper. At the far end of town, she could see the glow from the smithy forge, still burning despite the late hour. Without quite deciding to do so, she found herself descending the stairs, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stepping out into the night. It was madness. What she was doing. A woman alone on the streets after dark, heading toward the rough part of town. It was the sort of thing that could destroy a reputation forever. But her reputation felt like a cage she'd lived in so long she'd forgotten it had bars. And tonight, just for a moment, she wanted to see what lay beyond. The smithy was quiet, except for the low hiss of coals in the forge. Thomas sat on a bench outside, a book open on his lap, reading by the light of a lantern. He looked up as she approached, and she saw surprise flash across his features before he carefully set it aside. "Mrs. Pratt, is something wrong?" "No," she said, then more honestly, "Yes, everything, nothing." She laughed, a broken sound. "I don't even know anymore." He studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit, if you like." She shouldn't. Every rule of society, every lesson of propriety screamed against it. She sat. "What are you reading?" she asked, needing something, anything, to fill the silence. "Marcus Aurelius, The Meditations." He showed her the spine, worn smooth by handling. "Belonged to my brother." There it was again, that past tense that held whole worlds of grief. "Tell me about him," she said softly. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the glowing coals, he began to speak. His brother James had been younger by 5 years, smart as a whip and determined to make something of himself despite their hard-scrabble childhood. He'd saved every penny for books, read by candlelight until his eyes burned. He was in town buying supplies when the Clearwater Bank was robbed, Thomas said, his voice flat as hammered steel. Wrong place, wrong time. He got shot in the crossfire. When they couldn't find the real robbers, they decided he must have been part of it. Died in jail before the trial, still swearing he was innocent. Evelyn's hand moved without her conscious thought, covering his where it rested on his knee. His skin was rough and warm, and she felt him go very still beneath her touch. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a long time ago." "No," she said. "It wasn't, not for you." He turned his hand palm up, his fingers closing gently around hers. They sat like that, hands clasped in the darkness, while the forge coals died to ash and the night sounds of Clearwater drifted around them. When she finally rose to leave, he stood too, and for a moment they were close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating in his throat. "You shouldn't come here again," he said roughly. "People will talk." "People already talk," she replied. "They just don't say anything worth listening to." But she knew he was right. This, whatever this was, could only end in disaster. She was a married woman, bound by law and convention to a man who saw her as just another possession. Thomas was an outcast, tolerated for his skills but never accepted, carrying the weight of old suspicions and his brother's unmarked grave. As she made her way home through the empty streets, Evelyn felt something fundamental shifting inside her, like ice cracking on a frozen river. She'd spent so many years sleepwalking through her life, and now she was terrifyingly, brilliantly awake. The house was dark when she returned. Edward hadn't come home yet, and she didn't bother lighting the lamps. Instead, she climbed to her bedroom and stood at the window, looking out toward the smithy. The forge was dark now, but she imagined she could still see the glow, still feel the warmth of Thomas's hand in hers. In the drawer of her writing desk lay a half-finished letter to her sister in Chicago, full of pleasant lies about her pleasant life. Evelyn took it out, read the empty words, then slowly tore it to pieces. If she was going to write, she would write the truth, even if she could never send it. "Dear Catherine," she began again, "today I held a man's hand in the darkness, and for the first time in years, I remembered what it feels like to be alive. The days that followed took on a strange, fevered quality." Evelyn moved through her routines, morning calls, afternoon teas, evening dinners, but felt disconnected from it all, as if watching another woman play her part. Her hands poured tea, her lips smiled at appropriate moments, her voice made pleasant conversation, while her mind wandered to the smithy and the man who worked there. She began finding new reasons to venture near his shop. A broken parasol handle that surely needed a metal repair. A loose clasp on her jewelry box. Items so trivial that even Martha raised an eyebrow when Evelyn insisted on taking them personally. "I could send Samuel," "Ma'am?" the housekeeper offered, watching Evelyn wrap the jewelry box in cloth. "No need to trouble him," Evelyn replied, avoiding Martha's knowing gaze. "I have other errands in that direction." But Thomas had grown wary. When she arrived at the smithy, he would acknowledge her with a brief nod, take whatever needed repair, and give her a time to send someone to collect it. He kept his distance, kept their exchanges brief and businesslike, and never again allowed the kind of moment they'd shared that night on the bench. It was driving her to distraction. Meanwhile, the town gossips were circling like buzzards. Clara Morrison, the judge's wife, had taken to dropping by unexpectedly, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of Evelyn's appearance and manner. "You're looking peaked, dear," she said one afternoon, settling herself in the parlor without invitation. "Not sleeping well?" "The heat," Evelyn murmured, though autumn had brought cooler nights. Clara's smile was razor thin. "I do hope you're being careful. A woman in your position can't afford even the appearance of impropriety. Why, just the other day, I heard the most shocking story about Mrs. Garrett from Silver Creek. She was seen speaking alone with a traveling salesman, and now her husband has sent her back east to her family." The threat was clear as mountain water. Evelyn sipped her tea and made non-committal sounds while Clara continued her veiled warnings. After the woman finally left, Evelyn stood at the window, watching her march down the street like a soldier on patrol. That evening, Edward came home earlier than usual, bringing with him an unexpected guest. "Darling," he said, using the endearment that always sounded like a banknote in his mouth. "You remember Mr. Holbrook from Denver?" Evelyn did remember. William Holbrook was a business associate of Edward's, a man who dealt in land speculation and had the oily manner of someone who'd gotten rich off other people's misfortunes. He was also recently widowed, his wife having died under circumstances that remained deliberately vague. "Mrs. Pratt," Holbrook said, taking her hand and holding it a moment too long. "Lovely as ever. Your husband is a fortunate man." Throughout dinner, Evelyn became increasingly aware that she was being evaluated. Holbrook's eyes followed her movements, assessed her figure, calculated her worth like she was a property he was considering acquiring. Edward, far from discouraging this attention, seemed to be facilitating it, steering the conversation to highlight Evelyn's accomplishments, her refinement, her suitability. "Evelyn plays the piano," Edward mentioned, though she hadn't touched the keys in years. "And her needlework is quite exceptional." "Oh, a woman of many talents," Holbrook murmured, his gaze lingering on her neckline. "Your husband speaks of you often in our correspondence." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. What exactly had Edward been corresponding about? After dinner, the men retired to Edward's study for brandy and business talk. Evelyn escaped to her room, but even there she could hear the low rumble of their voices, occasionally punctuated by laughter that sounded like coins clinking. Unable to rest, she wrapped herself in a dark shawl and slipped out the back door. She had no destination in mind, just a desperate need to move, to breathe air that didn't smell of cigar smoke and calculated interest. Her feet carried her, inevitably, toward the smithy. She didn't intend to stop, just to walk past, but as she neared, she saw something that made her pause. Thomas was at the forge despite the late hour, but he wasn't alone. A young boy, perhaps 10 or 11, stood beside him, watching intently as Thomas demonstrated how to hold the hammer. "Feel the weight of it," Thomas was saying. "Don't fight it. Let it do the work." The boy, she recognized him as Jim Turner, whose father had died in a mining accident last winter, lifted the hammer awkwardly, nearly dropping it. "Easy." Thomas steadied the boy's grip. "Like this. There you go." Evelyn must have made some sound because Thomas looked up, his expression cycling through surprise, concern, and something else that made her heart race. He said something to the boy, who scampered off with a wave, and then Thomas was walking toward her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know." She pulled the shawl tighter. I needed to walk." He studied her face, and she wondered what he saw there. Something's wrong. It wasn't a question. Somehow, this man who kept himself so distant had learned to read her like one of his books. "My husband has a business associate visiting," she said carefully. "Mr. Holbrook from Denver." Thomas's jaw tightened. Even here, at the edge of town, Holbrook's reputation had preceded him. "I see. Do you?" The words burst out of her, sharp with frustration. "Do you see what it's like to sit at your own dinner table and be appraised like livestock? To realize your husband is marketing you like one of his investments?" Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it stopped her cold. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't burden you with this." "Come here," he said roughly, and led her around to the back of the smithy where a small lean-to provided shelter. There was a bench there, and he gestured for her to sit. "Tell me." So she did. In halting words, she told him about the loveless years of her marriage, about the child she'd lost and Edward's cold response. "These things happen. We'll try again when you're stronger." About the slow realization that she was not a wife, but an acquisition, valued for her beauty and breeding and ability to host dinner parties. Thomas listened without interrupting, his presence solid and reassuring in the darkness. When she finally fell silent, drained by her confessions, he spoke. "My brother used to say that some chains are forged of iron and some of expectations, but they bind just the same." He paused. He was usually talking about me, trying to get me to see beyond my own guilt. Guilt over what? I wasn't there when he needed me. I was working the rail lines in Kansas, sending money home when I could. If I'd been here... He shook his head. Might not have changed anything. Might have gotten us both killed, but at least I'd have tried. Evelyn turned to face him. In the dim light, she could see the pain etched in the lines of his face, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of stubble under her palm. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. He caught her hand, pressing it against his face for just a moment before gently lowering it. "You should go home." "Should I?" "Evelyn." Her name was a warning, a plea. "You know where this leads. Nothing good can come of it." "Good?" She laughed bitterly. "What in my life is good? Thomas, tell me that. What do I have that's worth preserving?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "You have more to lose than you know, and I won't be the one to take it from you." But even as he said it, his hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a desperate kind of gentleness. They sat like that, hands clasped, neither willing to let go, both knowing they should. Finally, church bells tolled the late hour, breaking the spell. Evelyn rose reluctantly. "Will you stop coming here?" Thomas asked. She looked at him, at this man who'd shown her more genuine care in these few stolen moments than her husband had in 15 years. "I'll try," she said, knowing it was a lie, knowing he knew it too. As she walked home through the empty streets, Evelyn thought about chains, the ones we forge for ourselves and the ones others forge for us. She thought about the boy learning to work the forge, about second chances and new skills. She thought about Thomas's hands, scarred but gentle, and the way he'd said her name like a prayer. Back at the house, she could see Edward's study window still lit, planning her future, no doubt, calculating her value in his endless ledgers. She climbed the stairs to her room and sat at her writing desk, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. This time, she didn't write to her sister. Instead, she wrote to herself, pouring out all the words she couldn't say aloud, all the feelings she couldn't acknowledge in daylight. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and hid it beneath the false bottom of her jewelry box, the one with the recently repaired clasp. Outside her window, a wolf howled somewhere in the distant hills, and Evelyn pressed her hand to the glass, feeling its coolness against her palm. She was playing with fire, she knew, but after so many years of cold ashes, even the threat of burning felt like being alive. The October moon hung low and cold over Clearwater, casting silver shadows across the empty streets. Evelyn stood at her window, Edward's snores echoing from his separate bedroom down the hall. She'd tried to resist for 3 days, but the pull was too strong, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. She dressed in her darkest clothes, moving with the careful silence of someone who'd learned to navigate a house full of creaking boards and judgment. The back door opened without sound. She'd oiled the hinges herself that afternoon, and then she was free, moving through the night like a shadow. The smithy was dark, but she knew he was there. She could feel his presence the way she felt the approaching storms, a change in the air that made her skin prickle with awareness. "I told you not to come back," his voice rumbled from the darkness as she approached. "You did," she agreed, stepping into the shelter of the lean-to. "And I tried to listen." He emerged from the shadows, and in the moonlight she could see the war in his eyes. Desire battling with honor. Need fighting against conscience. "This is madness," he said roughly. "Yes," she whispered, moving closer. "It is." For a long moment they stood frozen, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Thomas made a sound low in his throat, somewhere between a growl and surrender, and pulled her against him. His kiss was nothing like the chaste pecks Edward occasionally bestowed. This was fire and desperation, years of loneliness pouring out in the clash of lips and breath. Evelyn's hands found his hair, holding him as if he might disappear, while his arms wrapped around her with a strength that should have frightened her but only made her feel safe. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Evelyn," he said her name like a man drowning. "We can't, I know." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "I know all the reasons why we can't. Tell me one reason why we should." He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest where his heart hammered against his ribs. Because I've been dead inside since James died, and you make me want to live again. Because when I see you, I forget all the reasons I should stay away. Because—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Because I'm a selfish man, and I want something for myself. Just once." The honesty in his voice broke something inside her. She rose on her toes and kissed him again, softer this time, trying to pour all the words she couldn't say into the touch of her lips. He led her into the smithy, to a small room at the back where he kept a narrow cot for nights when work ran late. It was humble, rough boards and a thin mattress, but when he lit a candle, the light turned everything golden. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she answered. What followed was a revelation. Where Edward had always taken, Thomas gave. Where Edward had been perfunctory, Thomas was patient. His work-roughened hands were gentle as they loosened her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. He touched her like she was something precious, something worth savoring. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her throat. "So perfect." "I'm not," she protested, thinking of all the ways she'd been found wanting over the years. "You are to me," he said simply, and the truth in his voice made her eyes sting with unshed tears. They came together with a desperate tenderness, two lonely souls finding harbor in each other. Evelyn discovered that passion wasn't the cold, mechanical thing she'd known, but something wild and generous and transformative. In Thomas's arms, she felt cherished, desired, alive in ways she'd never imagined possible. Afterward, they lay entwined on the narrow cot, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers combed through her hair, and she felt more at peace than she had in years. "I used to dream about leaving," Thomas said quietly, "taking what little I have and heading west, maybe California, starting over where nobody knows my name or my history." "Why didn't you?" "James is buried here. Seemed wrong to leave him." He paused. "And then you walked into my shop with your broken wheel, looking like a lady from a painting, and I knew I was in trouble." Evelyn lifted her head to look at him. "I'm glad you stayed." "Are you?" His hand cupped her cheek. "This can only end badly." "Evelyn, you know that." "I don't care," she said fiercely. "I've lived my whole life doing what's expected, what's proper, what's safe, and what has it gotten me? A cold house, a colder husband, and a future that looks like a prison cell. If I can have this, have you, even for a little while, then I'll take whatever consequences come." He pulled her down for a kiss that was answer enough. They dozed fitfully, aware that dawn would come too soon. When the first gray light began to seep through the windows, Evelyn reluctantly began to dress. Thomas watched from the cot, memorizing every movement. "When can I see you again?" she asked, hating how desperate she sounded. "You shouldn't." "When?" he sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There's a barn dance Saturday night at the miller's farm. Half the town will be there." "Including my husband," Evelyn said bitterly. Edward never missed a chance to glad-hand potential customers. "But you could slip away. Meet me by the old well behind the barn. Nobody goes there anymore." It was risky, foolish even. She nodded immediately. "I'll be there." As she prepared to leave, Thomas caught her hand. "Evelyn, be careful. If anyone suspects—" "I know." She squeezed his fingers. "I'll be careful." But as she made her way home through the lightning streets, Evelyn realized that careful was the last thing she felt. She felt reckless, Wild, transformed. The woman who'd left the Pratt house last night seemed like a stranger compared to the one returning. She slipped back inside just as Martha was starting the kitchen fires. If the housekeeper noticed anything amiss, she gave no sign, merely nodding as Evelyn passed in her room. Evelyn caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her hair was mussed, despite her attempts to pin it properly. Her lips swollen from kisses, her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously like joy. She looked alive in a way that no amount of proper grooming had ever achieved. The sound of Edward moving around in his room sent her hurrying to make herself presentable. By the time he appeared for breakfast, she was the picture of wifely propriety, serving his coffee just the way he liked it, listening to his plans for the day with every appearance of interest. "Holbrook will be returning next week," he mentioned casually, but his eyes watched her closely. "He was quite taken with you." "How nice," Evelyn murmured, spreading jam on her toast with steady hands. "He's looking for a new wife, someone with breeding and grace." Edward set down his cup with deliberate precision. "His business ventures have been extremely profitable. A partnership with him could be very advantageous." The meaning was clear as crystal. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "I see. I knew you would." Edward rose, satisfied. "You've always been a practical woman, Evelyn. It's one of your better qualities." After he left, Evelyn sat alone at the breakfast table, staring at the congealing eggs on her plate. Practical. Is that what he thought her empty compliance had been all these years? Practicality? She thought of Thomas's hands on her skin, of the way he'd looked at her like she was a miracle, of the life and heat and joy she'd found in his arms. Then she thought of Holbrook's calculating gaze, of being traded from one cold bed to another, of a future that stretched ahead like a tomb. No, not anymore. Not after last night. She rose from the table with new determination. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay, she would not go gently back into that good night of respectability. She had tasted freedom, passion, truth, and she would fight to keep it, even if it meant losing everything else. The morning sun climbed higher, painting Clearwater in shades of gold and dust, and in the finest house on Main Street. Evelyn Pratt began to plan her revolution. The Miller farm blazed with lanterns and laughter on Saturday night, the barn doors thrown wide to welcome half of Clearwater for the harvest dance. Fiddle music spilled out across the yard, mixing with the sounds of boots on wooden floors and the chatter of neighbors temporarily forgetting their feuds in favor of celebration. Evelyn arrived on Edward's arm, wearing her blue silk dress, not the green he'd requested, a small rebellion, but it felt like armor. Edward barely noticed, too busy scanning the crowd for potential business contacts. "Ah, there's Judge Morrison," he said, already steering her in that direction. "Be charming, Evelyn. I'm hoping to secure the contract for the courthouse expansion." She smiled and nodded and played her part, all while her eyes searched the crowd for a different figure entirely. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. But then, he wouldn't be. A man with his reputation wouldn't be welcome at such gatherings, no matter how skilled his hands were at the forge. The evening crawled by in a blur of dances with Edward's associates, their hands too familiar on her waist, their breath too close to her ear. She smiled until her face ached, made small talk until her throat was dry, and watched the moon rise higher through the barn windows. Finally, during a particularly energetic reel that had drawn most of the crowd onto the dance floor, she slipped away. The night air was cool on her flushed skin as she made her way around the barn, past the wagons and tethered horses, to where the old well stood abandoned in a grove of cottonwoods. He was there, a shadow among shadows. And her heart leaped so hard she pressed a hand to her chest. "You came," Thomas said, stepping into the moonlight. "Did you doubt I would?" "Every minute." He reached for her, then stopped, his hands dropping. "Evelyn, we need to talk." The serious tone sent ice through her veins. "What's happened?" Clara Morrison came to the smithy yesterday. Said she needed a new coal scuttle, but that wasn't why she was there. His jaw tightened. She asked questions. About you, about how often you visit, about whether you come alone. Evelyn closed her eyes. Of course. Clara Morrison, defender of propriety and destroyer of reputations. What did you tell her? The truth, that you're a customer, nothing more. But she didn't believe me. He moved closer, his voice dropping. She knows. Evelyn, or suspects enough to make trouble. Let her suspect, Evelyn said fiercely. I don't care anymore. You should care. You don't know what people like her can do, don't I? She laughed bitterly. I've lived under their thumbs for 15 years. Thomas, I know exactly what they can do. The question is whether I'll let them do it anymore. He caught her shoulders, his grip almost painful. This isn't a game. If they turn on you, if your husband casts you out, then I'll be free, she interrupted. Don't you see? The worst thing they can do to me is set me free. With nothing, no money, no home, no respectable work. I'll have you, she said simply. The words hung between them like a challenge. Thomas's face twisted with emotion, hope, fear, love, anguish, all warring in his storm-gray eyes. I can't offer you anything, he said roughly. A room above the smithy, work roughened hands. A name that's still mud in this town? Evelyn silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her certainty into the contact. When she pulled back, they were both breathless. I need to tell you something, she said, about the child I lost. Thomas went still, but his hands gentled on her shoulders. Waiting. She lived 3 days, Evelyn whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. So small, so perfect. I held her and sang to her and promised her the world, and when she died, Edward wouldn't even let me name her. Said there was no point in getting attached to something that was never meant to be. Tears she'd held back for years finally spilled over. He had her buried in the paupers section because he didn't want to pay for a proper plot. My daughter, thrown away like she never mattered. And I let him do it because I was young and scared and thought I had no choice. Thomas pulled her against him, his arms a sanctuary as she wept for the child she'd never been allowed to mourn, for the woman she'd been, for all the years of emptiness that had followed. I won't live that way anymore, she said when she could speak again. I won't pretend and smile and die by degrees, not when I know now what it's like to feel alive. Then we leave. Thomas said suddenly, Tonight, now, my offer still stands. California, Oregon, anywhere you want. We'll disappear before they can stop us. The offer was tempting as water in the desert. To simply vanish, to start over where no one knew their names or their sins. But, your brother, she said softly, you can't leave him. Thomas's laugh was pained. James is dead. Evelyn, maybe it's time I stopped living for ghosts. Or maybe it's time we stopped running from them. She pulled back to look at him. I have money, not much, but some. Jewelry I can sell. We could leave, yes. But what if we stayed and fought instead? Fought how? Your husband owns half this town. The judge, the sheriff, they're all in his pocket. He was cut short by the sound of footsteps approaching through the grove. They sprang apart just as a figure emerged from the shadows. Well, well. Clara Morrison's voice was sweet as poisoned honey. What an interesting discovery. Evelyn's heart hammered, but she lifted her chin. Mrs. Morrison, looking for the privy? It's closer to the barn. Don't play games with me, girl. Clara stepped closer, and in the moonlight her face was sharp with triumph. I knew you were meeting someone, though I must admit, I expected someone with a bit more standing. I don't know what you think you saw, Evelyn began. I saw enough. Clara's smile was vicious. Your husband will be very interested to hear about his wife's midnight wanderings. Very interested indeed. She turned to go, but Thomas moved faster, blocking her path. For a moment, violence crackled in the air like heat lightning. Move aside, Clara commanded, but her voice wavered. Mrs. Morrison, Thomas said quietly, dangerously. You might want to reconsider. Are you threatening me? Warning you. His voice was flat as hammered iron. See, I know things too. About your husband, about the money that went missing from the courthouse construction fund, about who really helped it go missing. Clara went white as bleached bone. You're lying. Maybe, but mud sticks, doesn't it? That's what folks like you taught me. He stepped aside, gesturing to the path. Go ahead. Run to Edward Pratt. Start throwing stones. Just remember, I've got a pile of my own, and I've had 5 years to practice my aim. For a long moment, Clara stood frozen. Then, without another word, she gathered her skirts and fled back toward the barn. Thomas, Evelyn breathed. Is it true about the judge? True enough. He turned to her, his face grim. But it won't hold her for long. She'll find another way to hurt you, one that doesn't risk her own reputation. Then we don't have much time. Evelyn squared her shoulders. I need to get back before Edward notices I'm gone, but tomorrow, can you meet me at the cemetery, where your brother is buried? Evelyn, trust me, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him quickly. I have an idea. She hurried back toward the barn, her mind racing. Behind the Methodist church, in the Negro section of the cemetery, lay a small, unmarked grave that she'd visited in secret for 3 years. Her daughter might not have a stone, but she had a mother who remembered, and perhaps it was time for both the dead and the living to finally have their say. The dance was still in full swing when she slipped back inside. Edward found her almost immediately, his face flushed with drink and success. Where were you? He demanded. The privy, she said coolly. Unless you'd prefer I use the dance floor, he grunted, already distracted by something Judge Morrison was saying. But over the judge's shoulder, Evelyn caught Clara Morrison's eye. The older woman's gaze was venomous, but there was uncertainty there too. Good. Let her wonder. Let her worry. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn Pratt was ready to fight. The cemetery lay shrouded in morning mist when Evelyn arrived, her dark cloak making her nearly invisible among the headstones. She moved quickly through the rows of proper graves with their carved angels and flowery epitaphs, past the section where Clearwater's founding families rested in marble-marked prominence, to the far corner where the ground grew rough and the markers simple. Thomas was already there, standing before a wooden cross that bore only the initials J.W. and a date. His shoulders were bowed as if carrying invisible weight. You came, he said without turning. I told you I would. She moved to stand beside him, reading the roughly carved letters. You made this? Nobody else would. His voice was flat. They buried him like a criminal. I had to dig him up myself, move him here where at least it's consecrated ground. Evelyn slipped her hand into his, feeling the calluses and scars. Tell me what really happened. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring at his brother's grave, he began to speak. James had saved up $40. Took him 2 years of clerking at the general store, living on cornmeal and hope. He was going to buy books, maybe even apply to that teacher's college in Denver. A bitter laugh. $40. The bank lost more than that in a single bad loan. But to James, it was everything. The mist swirled around them as he continued. He went to deposit it, was standing at the teller window when 3 men burst in, started shooting before anyone could move. The teller went down first, then Mr. Carlson, who'd been arguing about his mortgage. James tried to run, took a bullet in the back. Evelyn's grip tightened on his hand. When the shooting stopped, 2 customers were dead, the teller was dying, and James was bleeding out on the floor. The robbers got away with near $3,000. Thomas's jaw worked. But when the sheriff showed up, he found $40 in James's pocket, his life savings that he'd never had a chance to deposit. That was enough to name him accomplice. But surely people knew him. Knew he wouldn't? Didn't matter. Town needed someone to blame. The real robbers were long gone. But here was James Ward. Poor. No family that mattered. Already dying. Easy to paint him as the inside man. Thomas turned to her, his eyes blazing. Your husband signed the papers. Said the evidence was clear. Had him thrown in jail instead of taken to the doctor. James died 3 hours later, still trying to tell them he was innocent. Evelyn felt sick. Edward knew. Maybe, maybe not. Didn't matter to him either way. Case closed. Town could feel safe again. Bank could claim insurance. Thomas looked back at the grave. I came back from Kansas to find my brother buried in shame and his name ruined forever. They stood in silence, surrounded by the dead and the weight of old injustices. Then Evelyn gently tugged him away from James's grave, leading him deeper into the cemetery's forgotten corners. Here, she said softly, stopping before a patch of ground marked only by a small pile of river stones. This is why I wanted to meet here. Thomas looked at the unmarked grave, understanding dawning in his eyes. Your daughter, Margaret. The name came out like a prayer. I named her anyway, even if Edward wouldn't let me carve it in stone. Margaret Rose. She would have been 3 this summer. She knelt, arranging the stones she'd brought one by one over the months. I come here when I can, tell her about the world she missed, about her mother who loved her more than life. She looked up at Thomas. I want her to know about you, about the man who makes me want to live again. Thomas knelt beside her, his rough hand covering hers on the stones. Evelyn, we've both been living for the dead, she said quietly. Maybe it's time we started living for each other. Before he could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both tense. Thomas rose, positioning himself protectively in front of Evelyn as Sheriff Patterson rounded the cemetery gate, accompanied by 2 deputies. Thomas Ward, the sheriff called out, his hand resting on his pistol. Need you to come with us. On what charge? Thomas didn't move. Assault and attempted ravishment of a respectable woman. Patterson's weathered face was grim. Mrs. Clara Morrison swears out a complaint that you accosted her at the Miller farm, made improper advances, and threatened her person when she refused. Evelyn gasped. That's a lie. Patterson's eyes shifted to her, taking in her presence with obvious surprise. Mrs. Pratt, what are you doing here? She thought frantically. I was visiting my daughter's grave. Mr. Ward he was helping me locate it. The grounds are so overgrown here. That's so? Patterson clearly didn't believe a word. Well, ma'am, you'd best head home. Your husband's looking for you. Sheriff, Mrs. Morrison's claims are false, Evelyn said desperately. I was there, at the farm. I saw. You saw nothing. Thomas cut her off sharply. He gave her a look that pleaded for silence. Go home, Mrs. Pratt. This doesn't concern you. Thomas, go! His voice was hard as iron. Now. Patterson nodded to his deputies, who moved forward with shackles. Thomas submitted without resistance, but his eyes never left Evelyn's face. I'll be fine, he said quietly. Take care of yourself. They led him away, and Evelyn stood frozen among the graves, watching until they disappeared from view. Then, gathering her skirts, she ran. Not home, never home. Instead, she headed for the one place that might offer hope, the office of Josiah Whitman, the only lawyer in town who'd ever stood up to Edward's influence. She'd need help, and she'd need it fast. But when she reached Whitman's office above the general store, she found Edward already there, seated in the lawyer's chair like he owned it, which, she realized with dawning horror, he probably did. Ah, Evelyn. Edward's smile was cold as winter frost. Right on time, mister. Whitman and I were just discussing your future. Edward. Silence. The word cracked like a whip. You've embarrassed me for the last time. Mister, Whitman has drawn up commitment papers. It seems you've been suffering from hysteria, delusions, wandering about graveyards and making wild accusations. Clearly you need rest and medical attention. You can't I? Edward rose, straightening his vest. Judge Morrison has already signed the order. You'll be on tomorrow's train to the St. Catherine Sanitarium in Denver. For your own good, of course. Evelyn looked desperately at Whitman, but the lawyer couldn't meet her eyes. Another soul bought and paid for. What about Thomas? She demanded. The blacksmith. Edward's laugh was ugly. Oh, he'll hang. Clara Morrison is quite convincing when she testifies, and Judge Morrison does so hate men who threaten his wife, though I suspect the charge will be upgraded once they search his rooms. Amazing what evidence can turn up. Stolen goods from that old bank robbery. Perhaps, maybe even some of the missing money. You're framing him. The words came out flat. Dead. I'm protecting my interests. Edward moved closer, and she could smell the pomade in his hair, see the satisfaction in his eyes. Did you really think I didn't know? Every time you slipped out, every glance you threw his way? I own this town. Evelyn, nothing happens here without my knowledge. Then why? Because you were useful. Holbrook wants a wife with spirit, says it's more satisfying to break them. The sanitarium will soften you up nicely. A few months of cold baths and laudanum, and you'll be quite ready for your new husband. His smile widened. I've already negotiated a fair price. Your sale will finance the railroad spur quite nicely. Evelyn felt the world spinning, tilting off its axis. This couldn't be happening. Not in America, not in 1887. Women had rights, laws protected. But looking at Edward's triumphant face, at Whitman's ashamed silence, she understood. Laws only protected those who could afford them. Justice was just another commodity in Clearwater, and Edward Pratt controlled the market. I'll need to pack, she said numbly. Martha will handle that. You're to remain in your room until departure. He gestured to the door where she now saw one of the sheriff's deputies waiting. For your safety, of course, in your delicate condition. They escorted her home like a prisoner, and Evelyn walked with her head high, though inside she was screaming. As they passed the jail, she saw faces pressed against the barred windows. Not Thomas, but others who'd learned the price of crossing Edward Pratt. In her room, she listened to Martha moving about, packing her life into trunks, outside her window. She could see the smoke rising from the smithy forge, but no one tended it now. Night fell like a curtain, and Evelyn sat in the darkness, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would be gone, locked away where no one would hear her screams. Thomas would hang for crimes he didn't commit, just like his brother before him. Unless... She thought of Margaret's unmarked grave, of James's wooden cross, of all the invisible dead whose stories were never told. Perhaps it was time for the silent to speak. Moving carefully in the darkness, she pulled out her hidden letters, the ones she'd written but never sent, the ones that told the truth about Edward Pratt and his empire built on others' misery. If she could just get them to the right hands. But first, she had to escape this room, and for that, she would need an unlikely ally. Martha? She called softly through the door. May I have some tea for my nerves? Martha entered with a tea tray, her weathered face carefully neutral. She'd served the Pratt household for 8 years, keeping her eyes down and her thoughts to herself. But as she set the tray on the bedside table, Evelyn caught the slight tremor in her hands. Martha, Evelyn said softly, how is your grandson, the one who was hurt in the mine collapse? The housekeeper's composure cracked slightly. Still can't walk proper. Ma'am, doctor says he never will. And the mining company? They paid for his care, of course. A bitter laugh escaped before Martha could stop it. The Pratt Mining Company don't pay for nothing they don't have to. Said it was the boy's fault for being where he shouldn't. Evelyn nodded slowly. Your daughter, she still takes in washing to pay the doctor bills? When she can get work. Martha's voice was tight. Though folks been reluctant to hire her since she complained to Mr. Pratt about the accident. I see. Evelyn rose, moving to her writing desk. From the hidden compartment, she withdrew a roll of bills, money she'd saved over years by selling small pieces of jewelry, claiming them lost. There's $300 here, enough for the doctor and maybe a start somewhere else. Somewhere Edward Pratt's name doesn't close every door. Martha stared at the money like it might bite. I can't. You can. You will. Evelyn pressed the bills into her hands. Because I need your help. And because it's the right thing to do. The older woman's eyes filled with tears. What do you need? These letters. Evelyn pulled out her hidden correspondence. They need to reach Marcus Fletcher at the Denver Post. He's been investigating corruption in mining towns. I've been writing to him for months under a false name. There's enough here to bury Edward, but only if they reach Denver before I do. Martha took the letters, tucking them into her apron. The deputy's downstairs. How will you— Is the old servant's stair still clear? Yes, but there's another deputy at the back door. Evelyn smiled grimly. Then I'll have to go out the way I came in so many times, through the window. Martha's eyes widened. Ma'am, that's a 15-foot drop. Into the rose garden. I know. I've done it before. At Martha's shocked expression, Evelyn almost laughed. Oh, Martha, the things you don't know about this house's inhabitants would fill books. Together, they worked quickly. Evelyn changed into her darkest, simplest dress, something that wouldn't show dirt or tear easily. She pinned her hair severely back and wrapped herself in an old cloak of Martha's that smelled of lye soap and hard work. There's a midnight freight train, Martha whispered. Stops for water at the tower. If you could hide in one of the cars. No, I won't run. Not while Thomas is in that jail. Evelyn checked the window. The deputy below was leaning against a post, smoking. In a few minutes, he'd walk his round to the front of the house. When I'm gone, wait an hour, then raise the alarm. Say you brought tea and found the room empty. Where will you go? To wake the dead, Evelyn said cryptically. When the deputy disappeared around the corner, she slipped out the window, hanging from the sill before dropping into the rose bushes. The thorns tore at her clothes and skin, but she bit back any sound. Then she was running through the shadows, a ghost fleeing her own life. The jail stood like a tomb in the darkness, one barred window glowing with lamplight. The night deputy would be inside, probably dozing. But it wasn't the front she was interested in. Around back, where the cells faced the alley, she found what she was looking for. The window to Thomas's cell. He was there, sitting on the narrow cot, head in his hands. Thomas, she whispered urgently. His head snapped up, and he was at the window in 2 strides. Evelyn, what are you doing here? If they catch you, they're sending me to an asylum tomorrow, and you're going to hang for lies. She pressed against the bars. But not if I can help it? There's nothing you can do. Go, save yourself. Listen to me. Her voice was fierce. There's an old hunter named Elijah Morse, lives in a shack up Copper Creek. He saw the real bank robbers 5 years ago, recognized one of them. He's been too scared to talk, but he might now. Why would he? Because the man he recognized was wearing a sheriff's badge, not Patterson, the old sheriff, Daniels, who retired rich and sudden right after the robbery. She gripped the bars. Find Morse. Make him talk. It's your only chance. I'm locked in a cell. Evelyn, how am I supposed to— A sound from the street cut him off. Voices, coming closer. Evelyn pressed a small object through the bars, a lockpick she'd taken from Edward's desk. A reminder of his own criminal youth before he'd learned that stealing legally was more profitable. For when the time is right. She whispered, Evelyn. She silenced him with a kiss through the bars, tasting rust and desperation. I love you, she said simply. Live, fight, find me when this is over. Then she was gone, melting back into the shadows as voices grew louder. But instead of fleeing town as any sensible person would, she headed for the one place no one would look for her, the church. Reverend Samuels was a weak man, cowed by Edward's donations and threats. But his wife, Grace, was made of sterner stuff. She'd lost 2 sons to mining accidents and had no love for the Pratts. Evelyn slipped through the side door and made her way to the small room where Grace often spent nights when her arthritis was bad, tending the altar flowers and praying for the strength not to curse her enemies. Mrs. Samuels, the elderly woman, looked up, her eyes sharp despite the late hour. Evelyn Pratt, or should I say, Evelyn the fugitive? Half the town's looking for you. I need sanctuary. This isn't the Middle Ages, child. Churches don't protect criminals anymore. I'm not a criminal. I'm a woman who loved the wrong man and learned too many secrets. Evelyn moved closer. Your sons. Michael and David. They died in the Pleasant Valley collapse, didn't they? Grace's face hardened. Along with 14 others, all because Edward Pratt wouldn't pay for proper timber supports. What if I told you I had proof? Letters, documents, things Edward thought I was too stupid to understand when he left them on his desk. I'd say you were a day late and $1 short. You're bound for an asylum and you're Blacksmith for the gallows. Not if we act tonight. Evelyn leaned forward urgently. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow for Thomas's trial. Judge Morrison's already decided the outcome, but Circuit Judge Harlan is different. He's honest. If we could get evidence to him, what kind of evidence? Elijah Morse saw the real bank robbers, and I know where Edward keeps his real ledgers, the ones showing he's been skimming from the mining company, the bank, even the church building fund. Grace was silent for a long moment. Then, you're asking me to go against the most powerful man in town. I'm asking you to help me get justice. For your sons. For James Ward. For all the people Edward Pratt has crushed while building his empire. The older woman's hands clenched on her Bible. What do you need? A horse, men's clothes, and someone to deliver a message to Elijah Morse at first light. And then we bring down Edward Pratt and everyone who's helped him. Evelyn's smile was sharp as glass. Or we die trying. Grace stood slowly, her arthritis making her wince. My sons would have liked you. Evelyn Pratt, come, we have work to do. As they made their preparations, the courthouse clock struck 3. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what was supposed to be Evelyn's last day of freedom. But she'd learned something from Thomas, from his scarred hands and patient strength. Sometimes you had to forge your own freedom in the fire. And before this day was through, all of Clearwater would see what she'd been tempered into. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over Clearwater, matching the mood that hung over the courthouse. Word had spread like wildfire. Evelyn Pratt had vanished. The blacksmith remained in jail, and Circuit Judge Harlan had arrived a day early, catching everyone off guard. In the packed courtroom, Edward Pratt sat in the front row, his face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him, Clara Morrison clutched her handkerchief, ready to perform her role as the violated woman. Judge Morrison presided with obvious discomfort. His colleague's unexpected arrival had disrupted carefully laid plans. Bring in the accused, Judge Morrison commanded. Thomas was led in, shackled but unbowed. His eyes swept the crowd, searching for a face that wasn't there, or so everyone thought. In the back row, dressed in men's clothing with her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, Evelyn watched. Beside her sat Elijah Morse, trembling but determined, and Grace Samuels, clutching a leather satchel filled with documents. Thomas Ward, Judge Morrison began. You stand accused of assault and attempted, Your Honor. Circuit Judge Harlan interrupted smoothly. Given the serious nature of these charges and their potential connection to other crimes, I'll be presiding. Morrison's face flushed. This is highly irregular, as is trying a capital case without proper notice to the circuit court. Harlan's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. Proceed with the charges. Clara Morrison took the stand, her performance worthy of a stage actress. She spoke of being accosted, threatened, of fearing for her very life. But when Harlan began his cross-examination, her story began to fray. Mrs. Morrison, you say the defendant grabbed you. Where exactly did this occur? By the old well, behind the Miller barn. And you were alone there because I was looking for my husband. In the dark, behind an abandoned well. Harlan's eyes were sharp. How curious. And these threats, Mr. Ward allegedly made, can you repeat them exactly? Clara faltered. The script she'd memorized didn't include these questions. That's when Evelyn stood. Your Honor, I can answer that. The courtroom erupted. Edward shot to his feet, his face purple. That woman is mentally disturbed. She should be restrained. But Evelyn was already moving forward, pulling off her hat. I was there that night. I saw everything. You can't testify, Morrison sputtered. A wife cannot testify against her husband. I'm not testifying against him, Evelyn said calmly. I'm testifying for Mr. Ward and about what really happened 5 years ago." Harlan raised his hand for silence. "Approach the bench, Mrs. Pratt." What followed was legal theater at its finest. Evelyn spoke clearly, laying out the truth. Her meetings with Thomas, Clara's attempt at blackmail, Edward's threats. Then she played her ace. "Your Honor, I have here documents proving that my husband and several others, including former Sheriff Daniels, orchestrated the bank robbery 5 years ago. They needed the insurance money to cover embezzlement from the mining company. James Ward was murdered to provide a convenient scapegoat." "Lies," Edward roared. "She's insane." "Then you won't mind if we examine your private ledgers?" Harlan asked mildly. "The real ones, not the set you show the investors." Edward went white. That's private property, which can be subpoenaed in a capital case." Harlan turned to the bailiff. "Secure Mr. Pratt's office immediately." "Your Honor." Grace Samuels stood, her voice carrying over the chaos. "I have additional evidence. Letters between Mr. Pratt and Sheriff Daniels, planning the robbery. My late son Michael worked at the bank. He copied them before he died in the Pleasant Valley mine collapse." "Another convenient death." Elijah Moore spoke up, his voice cracked but determined. "Just like I saw Daniels and 2 others riding hard from town the day of the robbery. Moneybags on their saddles. Been too scared to speak up, but I'm tired of being scared." The courtroom descended into chaos. Edward tried to flee but was stopped by deputies. Clara Morrison fainted, genuinely this time. Judge Morrison sat frozen, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. Through it all, Thomas remained still, his eyes locked on Evelyn. She moved to him as the bailiff unlocked his shackles. "You came back," he said wonderingly. "I told you I would." She touched his face, not caring who saw. "We're free, Thomas, both of us." But freedom, they would learn, was more complex than simply removing chains. The trial that followed shook Clearwater to its foundations. Edward Pratt was convicted of embezzlement, conspiracy, and murder. Judge Morrison resigned in disgrace. Clara Morrison left town on the next train, her reputation in tatters. But for Evelyn and Thomas, the hardest part was yet to come. They stood in the cemetery on a crisp November morning, placing proper headstones on 2 graves. James Matthew Ward, beloved brother. Truth will out. Read 1. Margaret Rose, cherished daughter, forever loved. Read the other. "What now?" Thomas asked, his hand finding hers. Evelyn looked at the town spread below them. Some people crossed the street when they saw her. Others nodded with newfound respect. She'd lost her position but gained something more valuable. Herself. "Holbrook withdrew his offer," she said wryly. "Apparently, I'm too scandalous even for him. His loss." Thomas squeezed her hand. "The offer still stands. California. Oregon." "No." Evelyn turned to face him. "We've spent enough time running from ghosts. Maybe it's time we built something here, where our dead can rest easy." Thomas studied her face. "It won't be easy. People have long memories. Then we'll give them new things to remember." She smiled, and it was like sunrise after a long night. Grace Samuels is starting a school for minors' children. They need teachers, and the town needs an honest blacksmith. And a blacksmith needs a wife. Thomas said softly. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Ward?" "It's a promise. Mrs. Pratt, soon to be Mrs. Ward, if you'll have me." She answered with a kiss that tasted of ashes and hope, of endings and beginnings. They were married a week later in the church, with Grace Samuels and Martha, now a free woman with her grandson in Denver, as witnesses. The attendance was small but sincere, filled with those who'd also suffered under Edward Pratt's rule and now dared to hope for something better. That night, as they lay entwined in the room above the smithy, Evelyn traced the scars on Thomas's hands. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I'm where I choose to be." Outside, snow began to fall, covering Clearwater in a blanket of white. Come spring, it would melt away, revealing whatever had survived the winter. Some things would be broken beyond repair. Others would emerge stronger for having endured. In the warmth of the smithy, the forge fires burned low but steady, ready to shape whatever tomorrow might bring. And in the darkness, two souls who'd found each other against all odds held tight, knowing that love forged in truth was stronger than any chain. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still full of men who'd exploit the weak and women who were told to accept their cages. But it was also a place of possibility, where courage could overthrow corruption and love could conquer convention. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this tale from the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed following Evelyn and Thomas on their journey from loneliness to love, from captivity to freedom. Where are you listening to this story from? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, passion, and redemption from America's frontier days. What did you think of Evelyn's choice? Would you have had the courage to fight for love against such odds? Share your thoughts below.